Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. Je suis extrêmement heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour cette nouvelle conférence virtuelle de l'initiative IA et Société. I'm delighted to welcome you all today and our guest for a new virtual AI and Society event. For those who don't know me, my name is Florian Martin Barreto. I am an associate professor of law, the University Research Chair in Technology and Society, and the director of the End Society initiative that is co-presenting this event with the Center for Law, Technology and Society. Today's virtual event is part of the AI environment stream of the project on AI for healthy humans and environments that is supported by the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue, and that is co-stewarded by three leading Ottawa research groups: the Center for Law, Technology and Society, the Center for Health Law, Policy and Ethics, and the Institute for Science, Society and Policy. We're delighted to welcome you today for a conversation on the datafication of agriculture and the need for governance and regulatory frameworks to support social justice in the collection and use of farm data. Our conversation will be led by Dr. Kelly Brunson, who is a professor and the Canada Research Chair in Science and Society at the University of Ottawa, and she also leads the AI and environment stream at the initiative. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Brunson to kick off this conversation.
Merci Florian, and bienvenue à tous. Welcome everyone to this conversation, which was meant to happen last November, and then I got COVID quite badly. And then actually we had a presenter we almost didn't happen today. So I'm glad everyone is here and that the show is going on. I have a little slide deck to anchor my introductory thoughts. So I'm going to share my screen right now and start my introduction. Okay. So I wanted to begin by saying that in Canada, like other jurisdictions, in fact, we have legislation pertaining to the uses of personal data, like that harvested from social media engagement, or data pertaining to health or banking information or records. But we have no regulations specific to farm or agricultural data. And this is an issue because we're in the midst right now of a so-called agricultural revolution that is being a revolution engendered by the use of data collection, the aggregation of data into big data sets, and the use of algorithms or machine learning and AI. And I just grabbed this screen capture from the John Deere Precision Agriculture Technology website to kind of illustrate some of the tools that are being used, at the center of which is really data and data collection. So every new John Deere tractor, and this is true of other manufacturers as well, but John Deere happens to be a dominant player in the in farm machinery. But every John Deere tractor today is embedded with hundreds of sensors that collect data. So like social media engagement, from the moment the farmer opens the cab door, data are collected passively on the farmer, farm laborer, on the farm environment, the soil, moisture, pH, the crops, the working of the machine itself. And then those data are combined with other data sets, say collected, you see here, an unmanned aeronautic vehicle or drone, or data from even more remote sensing like satellite weather data, for example, or climate data. And the aggregated data sets are, the data sets are being aggregated by companies like John Deere, but also other input suppliers too, like, for example, Monsanto, the seed supplier, or Bayer Monsanto. They were acquired by Bayer in 2018. And the big data sets are being used to, on one level, drive information or advice to farmers. And you can see pictured here, this is the John Deere's version of this algorithmically derived or putatively data-driven advice. And it's given to farmers through smartphone app or an app on a tablet, and it's called My Farm Manager. So farmers are basically giving data passively to cloud-based infrastructure, but those data get aggregated by these firms. And then the farmer pays for data-specific or algorithmically derived advice on how to farm. And there's a lot of hope among industry proponents, but also academics. So here is the head of climate smart agriculture for Bayer Monsanto, who on World Food Day several years ago wrote, right, the world's population is growing, we need to feed the world, and we need to do so sustainably. And the digitalization of farming is going to help us do this. So the promise is that this data-driven advice will make farming more precise, right? Will lead to more judicious use of scarce inputs like water or fossil fuels, but also harmful inputs like agrochemicals. And this so-called precision agriculture or smart agriculture, there's a lot of enthusiasm among academics. So here, an early paper by these two scholars in the journal called Precision Agriculture, they say, you know, this is a paradigm shift in agriculture. This data-driven agriculture is going to substitute environmental information and knowledge for inputs. So amidst this sort of transition or so-called revolution, right, we have no regulatory attention to the collection and use of data. And this is a problem, I think, because if you look at the financial strategies, as I have, of the large agricultural businesses like the Bayer Monsantos or like the John Deeres, data are now a key part of their portfolio, database strategies, right? The selling of the advice for one, but even data themselves, and I'll get to that in a second. And just like other sectors, right? When the data sets, the aggregated data become an asset for these companies, right? Or they can be assetized, as in used, right, to make money or to create other channels for value, they are protected, right? According to trade secrecy law, scientists are not able to really speak freely about the algorithms, for example, and also the data sets themselves, right, are protected by intellectual property and copyright law, as are the algorithms. So I think there, you know, and this is a problem when we've talked about this as scholars and in terms of public attention, and certainly lawyers, right, write about the problems around data obfuscation, but also the potential when data become an asset for personal data to be misused. And that's why we have regulatory attention to the uses and misuses of personal data. And there's no reason to think that farm data couldn't be used similarly, not least because the data collected on farmers or more perhaps significantly farm laborers, like marginal farm laborers, temporary foreign workers, for example, in Canada, that there couldn't be misuses of personal data, right? And affronts to personal privacy and autonomy and identification. But there's other reasons to think that the ag sector might be unique and raising unique consequences. So the reason that we organized this panel today is I wanted it to be the beginning of a conversation around why specifically and what to do, why specifically think about agricultural big data and AI in terms of regulation or governance more broadly. But I think there's a distinction there to be made, and maybe in discussion we could talk about that. And I have two reasons, I'll just say, to launch the conversation why I think we need conversations like this. And one is that much of the farm level data is not personal. So in Canada, right, I said we have these pieces of legislation. One of our presenters will do this exegesis, so I won't go into detail. But the legislation covers personal data. What about all the farm data that's not of a personal kind? And I won't say much more on that for now. But two, and I think this is the really big thing, and I've published articles on this, that agri-food or the agri-food sector is potentially a really unique sector, raising unique issues around big data and AI that need specific or bespoke regulatory or legal attention. And I'll just raise one example of an issue. That historically, agricultural technologies, most recently genetically modified organisms, not the technologies themselves, but the legal infrastructure surrounding the tools. So for GMOs or GMO seeds, it was the licensing or is the licensing structure around them, has created all sorts of limitations for users. But one specific thing that the legal infrastructure around these new technologies has done is create relationships of dependence between farmers and specific corporations, and created, therefore, an increasing concentration among agribusinesses. And one thing I always say, and people who have heard me present before are probably sick of hearing me say it, is that agribusinesses were big tech before Facebook, before Google, before Amazon, or before Apple. These are some of the longest standing oligopoly corporations in the world. And they've used technologies, but more importantly, the legal infrastructure surrounding them to foster market concentration with all sorts of environmental and social justice implications. And this is just a screen capture from an article I'm currently working on. So I'm sharing research as it's being produced with a postdoctoral researcher and a PhD student. But we've read the legal agreements around data and around the data-based services by the big businesses. And we think that similar to GMOs and the licensing structure, the licenses and terms of use around data are potentially could be used in similar ways to engender increasing market concentration among agribusinesses with, again, social justice and environmental consequences. So that's just one tiny example why we need, and I'm going to breeze through these, why we need specific attention to big data and AI governance and regulation, or laws in particular, in the agri-food sector, in agriculture. And ultimately, I'm just going to lead into the conversation just saying this last thing, that access to healthy, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food security, or food sovereignty, is, I think, something that we should take seriously, like access to information or the right to protect personal privacy via information. So a basic human right. And when you have food as a basic human right meets data or information, privacy and security as a human right, that calls for a specific, I think, regulatory response. So hence the conversation today. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to our presenters. We're going to today hear from Sarah Louise Reuter, who's a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, who's working in this space. She has an environmental science background, but she works in a way on data regulation and the kind of political economy, or some of the issues around data uses and potential misuses. So she's going to present, it's a recorded presentation. Then we're going to hear from Jonathan Van Guns, who has worked for a variety of nonprofit organizations, the UN, but also Bill and Melinda Gates. And his work with Bill and Melinda Gates Corp Foundation, they recently produced a report, and he's going to present on that. Although Jonathan couldn't be with us, I'm going to present his slide deck on his behalf. And then we're going to hear from our discussant, Dr. Jonathan Gray, who's a senior lecturer or associate professor in critical infrastructure studies in the Department of Digital Humanities at King's in London. And he's writing a new book, I think that's MIT Press, on data and open data that maybe he'll talk about. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Sarah Louise Reuter.
Hello, my name is Sarah Louise Reuter. I'm a PhD candidate and public scholar at the University of British Columbia. I'm so grateful to be included on the panel today to talk about agricultural data governance in Canada. I'll look forward to hearing from the other presenters and what you all and the participants have to say in the recording after the fact. I completed the work I'll be speaking about today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of many Coast Salish peoples. Specifically, I live and work on the territories of the Squamish, Stalo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I'm going to share some of the insights from a document and policy analysis I've been working on for agricultural data in Canada. I was curious about what kinds of rules and policies are in place to determine who can do what with agricultural data, and then communicate those terms. So what I found fits in two main categories. There are government policies and corporate policies. Let's start with government policy. In Canada, at the federal level, there are two main pieces of legislation that pertain to data: the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, also known by its acronym PIPEDA, and the Privacy Act. Both pieces of legislation pertain to a specific kind of data: personal information. In the legislation, personal information is defined as any recorded information about an identifiable individual. This includes things like our age, race, ethnicity, religion, marital status, and other things that you might find personal to share. PIPEDA outlines the expectations for the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information by private actors and companies, whereas the Privacy Act outlines the expectations of handling personal information by the federal government. Importantly, the Privacy Act also outlines the mechanisms through which a person can request access to information about themselves that is currently held in a government office. I'll also mention that the provinces and territories have additional laws about data governance, often connecting freedom of information and privacy protection in one piece of legislation. It's an interesting time to be talking about data governance in Canada. The federal government is currently experiencing a potential wave of legislative reform. PIPEDA and the Privacy Act are over 20 years old, and so in June of 2022, Bill C-27 was tabled for its first reading and proposed 3 new statutes to either update or repeal some of the policies I've mentioned so far. The same month, there was also Bill C-26, tabled for its first reading, focusing on cybersecurity and changes to the Telecommunications Act. That's a quick overview of government policy about data in Canada, but there isn't a whole lot about agriculture in these policies. There are some agriculture relevant elements of PIPEDA and the Privacy Act, and personal information protection applies to all people in Canada, which includes, of course, farmers and farm workers. But there are no agriculture sector specific laws for data governance and privacy, and agricultural data that is not personal information is not quite addressed. And in this absence, corporate policies fill the gap. Now let's talk about corporate policy. Any private sector actor, whether that be a startup or a large multinational corporation, any entity that collects personal information must be compliant with PIPEDA. And this is the legal requirement for what we come across in our day-to-day lives as terms and conditions or signing agree to a privacy policy so that we can access a website or download an app. To study the role of corporate policy in agricultural data governance, I chose to focus on farm management apps. There's just so much going on when it comes to agricultural data governance in these devices and tools. There's the generation of data, there's the aggregation and analytics of data, there's using data from off of the farm to influence farm decisions, and then the dynamics of accumulating data and who gets to benefit from that accumulation. I chose 5 of the most commonly used farm management apps in Canada for this study. It matters who owns these farm management apps. So the cases I chose also illustrate some diversity in the sector of the parent company and where the headquarters is in Canada. So imagine that you're a farmer interested in using Climate Field View. You go to the website, and if you want information on data privacy, you see that it's underneath the Support tab. Your first impression is pretty positive. You see these encouraging words, our data privacy principles put you in the driver's seat. Climate Field View explains that you own your data is not for sale, and they explain a little bit more about the permissions and how they will protect it. Then at the bottom, they link to the official legal document. Even just by looking at the top of the privacy statement here, you can sense a shift in the mode of communication. It's a different style. This is technical language and meets the legal requirements both of PIPEDA and the liability needs of Climate Field View. Those are 2 examples of the document types I was analyzing. For each of the 5 farm management apps, I collected any policy or document that mentioned data, whether that be personal data collected or the collection or use of agricultural data. I used qualitative methods of coding for content and thematic analysis for each of the documents. Looking at the documents collectively, I found 4 main categories of information. Definitions, so what is personal information, data management protocols, explanations of what kind of data can be collected, how it can be used, and what rights or permissions are afforded to farmers, disclaimers, language of liability, and connections to other documents. So by signing this one, you're also agreeing to the other. For a user to be able to offer informed consent, they must first be able to understand the terms to which they are agreeing. So one way we can look at the accessibility of a text is how long it would take to read them to completion. We could also think about the proportion of common words in a text. According to psychology research on reading comprehension, ideally at least 95% of words in a text should already be familiar to the reader. And this is for people who are already fluent in the language. You can see from my column on the right that none of the farm management applications documents meet that threshold. This makes sense. These are technical, legally binding documents, but it's worth noting that this is a challenge and a potential obstacle for accessibility. Before I conclude, I want to share some of the insights of the policy and document analysis. So a lot of the apps claim that farmers own their data. You saw this with that first page of Climate Field View, but farmers only own some types of data. For example, the Ag Expert application from Farm Credit Canada explains that you are the owner of your ag data, so any data that your tractor generates as you're driving across the field. But as soon as that data is aggregated, farmers no longer own it. Here's another example. Personal information as a type of data is outlined in the privacy policy for Farm Command, and they say that you have particular permissions and rights about this data type. But as soon as that information is aggregated, it no longer counts as personal information, and those permissions are lost. So now Farm Command, for example, can archive non-personal information, aggregated personal information, permanently. You can't delete it. The next thing I want to draw attention to is selling data. It's a pretty common claim across these 5 farm management apps and beyond that the applications will not sell farmers' data. But the apps and their parent companies don't need to sell the data in order for it to be economically valuable. A lot of the value comes from the aggregate, and it helps to take a broader look of the food system dynamics of increasing corporate concentration through mergers and acquisitions. So, quick timeline. Climate Corporation developed Climate Field View in 2006 when they were a startup. Then they get bought by Monsanto in 2013, and then Bayer buys Monsanto and its subsidiaries in 2018. So now not only is there concentration in the market, but there's concentration in the accumulation of agricultural data and the value that that offers. In summary, government policy about data in Canada focuses primarily on personal information. Now, sometimes agricultural data counts as personal information because it would make an individual person identifiable, but not always. And what about all the data in agriculture that is not personal? There's currently no sector-specific law for agricultural data governance in Canada, and I view this as a problem. All actors that collect personal data and engage in commercial activity have a legal requirement to communicate the terms under which they are interacting with the data. This is what we looked at with the corporate policies for farm management applications. But even when they meet the legal requirements, we really need to read between the lines to understand what they can and cannot do with agricultural data. And even with the most exhaustive policies, there are some questions that remain unanswered. This presents governance challenges for the ownership and control of our data for farmers, as well as some challenges around how it can be used and shared and for whose benefit. My main takeaway from this work is that the status quo is insufficient for protecting the rights and interests of farmers and farm workers. Instead, Canada needs an agriculture-specific approach to data governance in the food system. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conversation today.
Great. So now we're going to pivot, and I am going to present on behalf of Jonathan Van Guns, on behalf of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation report that he was going to present from. So I have his slide deck, and Melissa is going to put the link to the full length report in the chat for everyone who's interested to read the full report. So the title of Jonathan's talk is Farmer-Centric Data Governance. And I would say, I kind of alluded to this in my intro, actually we had a conversation, Florian and myself and others at the Center for Law, Technology and Society in organizing this panel. Should it be called Governing Big Data and AI in Agriculture? Or should it be called Regulating? And because there is an interesting conversation, I think, to be had about what that distinction is, and then how that's currently playing out. And so I mentioned this only because while Sarah Louise's presentation highlighted very well, and I said it in the intro, there's currently no, at least in Canada, but similarly elsewhere, regulations or legislation specific to agricultural data, or maybe environmental, non-personal data more broadly. And there ought to be. I think, right, one thing that's been happening is a kind of move toward governance. Something that's not codified into legislation, that's largely being initiated by volunteer organizations, the nonprofit or human rights sector, the philanthropic sector, including Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I'm on a UN level working group on data and data sharing. And there's a lot of work and mobilization there to talk about governance mechanisms, right? Not yet or not codified into law. And this report really outlines potential governance approaches and mechanisms for trying to engender social and environmental justice in the uses of data by the private, but also public sector, but through governance approaches, so rather than regulation. And so maybe in discussion, we could have an interesting conversation about that distinction, governance versus regulation. So I'm presenting again on behalf of Jonathan Van Gunst, on behalf of this report produced by with help from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, called Farmer-Centric Data Governance Towards a New Paradigm. So why do we need to look for new paradigms around data? Similar to my opening, right? Jonathan says that the benefits of agricultural technology, and in particular digitalization, right, at the center really of all of these tools, the sensor-based equipment, the algorithms and algorithmic advice or decision support tools are data. And this is really promising to revolutionize agriculture, not just in the global north, but there's a lot of enthusiasm for what is called largely climate smart agriculture in low and middle income countries in the global south. So amidst this revolution, right, we need a paradigm for data governance. Digital agriculture, this report says, right, is on a trajectory to evolve farming, presents opportunities. I presented some in my presentation, but there is a need to unpack some of the potential challenges. And we know there are challenges, not just because some of us, like myself, are looking specifically at challenges like data bias, the lock-in, right, lock-ins, data privacy in the ag sector, but because we know from other sectors like health, right, or like banking or social media that there are challenges in the uses of data. So the goals, this report really makes the claim that one approach, a kind of broad paradigm for how to manage some of the issues raised by the digitalization and specifically the collection of data in agriculture, is to use a farmer-centric approach to governance. And the report really details different governance models or strategies. We might call them mechanisms. And it does so by looking at case studies. But just more broadly, the kind of overarching argument that the report makes is that whatever the mechanism or strategy, it ought to be farmer-centric. And it ought to use participatory data governance, as in, right, farmer-driven design and implementation of a data governance approach, as well as farmer-driven methods of data gathering and data sharing and access. So a kind of central theme in this report, even though it's about mechanisms for governing the collection, the infrastructure and the uses around farm data, a central sort of thread is around access and openness of data. So access to among farmers, not just to the policies and the mechanisms for governing data, like in Sarah Louise's presentation, right? The commercially available tools largely aimed at farmers in the global north. If you look at, as I have and as she has, at the license or legal agreements, they're pretty impenetrable, right? So there's a lack of kind of access or transparency around the governance. But also in this Bill and Melinda Gates report, a central theme is around access to data. Okay, so what are some of the models for farmer-centric or participatory data governance? The study includes 6 kind of, they call them deep dives because they're case studies into different models. Just broadly, they're data collaboratives and data commons. So sharing data, a pool of data in a somewhat kind of close-knit or closed innovation community. And I've studied some of these communities in the US and in Canada who work according to copyright commons or data commons methods of data governance. Another broad mechanism is data cooperatives. So, right, people who can buy into an innovation, a data-based farm innovation with their data, but then they also have an equal stake in profit that might be generated from the use of data on their individual farm operation, but also others. A data fiduciary model. So data trusts is one example that I'm going to go through. I'm using a case from the report in just one moment. So, and then the last one, driven data sovereignty approaches. And I'm also going to go through one of the report's cases specific to that mechanism or model. So as I said, the report details, and I urge you to look at the detail of the report, but it details these different mechanisms for farmer-centric data governance, again, not regulation formal, but governance, through case studies. And I'm just going to go through 3 at really high level, not least because I'm not an author on this report. I'm presenting on behalf of Jonathan, one of the authors, but also for reasons of time. But one of the cases in the report that outlines one of the first mechanisms in terms of the data commons is this, this mechanism is the data trust, is the example of Digital Green and FarmStack, where this group used a third party, so a neutral third party, as a data collector and aggregator and manager in order to have the data managed in a way that was financially separate from the profit generation or any gains, even to the individual farmer from this innovation. So at broad level, this is using a neutral third party to kind of manage or govern the data collected in the context of an innovation system. We have something actually like this in Canada. I'm not sure Jonathan was going to mention this, but we have what's called in Canada Ag Data Transparent. And in my interviews with farmers across Canada, there's been a kind of uneven adoption of the use of Ag Data Transparent. But what Ag Data Transparent in Canada is an example of farmer-centric data governance in that it's a for-farmer neutral third party that's meant to ensure a set of principles around the use of farm-level data. And private enterprises can get a certification from Ag Data Transparent that they will or will not do certain things with your data from this neutral third party. And then farmers can know, right, that their data are secure. For example, their privacy is secured if the company has this stamp of approval from Ag Data Transparent. And this neutral aggregator example or case study is similar in this Bill and Melinda Gates report. Another mechanism is the idea of Indigenous-led data sovereignty. And the UN working group I'm a part of is very much fostering this principle or this mechanism for data governance or good governance, just governance of agricultural data. And the basic idea is to use Indigenous stewardship over land and material resources to use similar principles around the ownership over data specific to Indigenous populations. And there are models for this outside of the agricultural context, say, for example, by pharmaceutical industries, indigenous-led management of biological data. But this is basically using indigenous-led principles and maybe extant models of indigenous governance to create stewardship over data that's specific to indigenous populations. And, if we're looking outside of a global northern context, many farmers in the world, the vast majority, are peasant farmers. And so this becomes a model for agricultural data governance that makes a lot of sense when you look from a global perspective. Okay, and the last case I'll point you toward in this report, but again, I urge you to go to the report that Jonathan was going to speak of, was the mechanism or the model of co-designing a data-based innovation, say a platform for decision-making in agriculture. In this case, it's a fisheries example in their report, but co-designing the data, the tool, right, including deciding which data to collect and how to weight the data infrastructure, and then how to who's going to benefit from those data, right? The sort of data policies, etc. Co-designing that from the get-go with the communities who are going to be using the tool. You see this approach really being advanced within human-computer interaction literature. I myself have a very small-scale project doing this with market gardeners in Southern Ontario in the Outaouais region in Quebec. But this idea mechanism for data governance is basically to co-design the data strategy from the very get-go with the end users or user communities. So in the end, the report that Jonathan was going to speak to makes a series of recommendations. One is to use user-centric and specifically farmer-centric governance models. They should be integrated into private sector and certainly public sector ag data initiatives. That really the foundation of any initiative should be to foster trust as a principle, that data governance approaches should be consistent and be premised upon data sharing. And as I said before, a theme in this report is really around openness and access to data as an important principle of data governance. Meaningful participation must be the center of data governance. That's probably self-evident. But also the report is interesting in that the cases, if you look at them, really highlight that, that there isn't a one size fits all approach, perhaps, that fits every solution in every jurisdiction, right, in relation to every technology or every end user or farmer group. Okay. So thank you on behalf of Jonathan. I'm sure he would be very happy to receive emails, and his email is here, but it also should be linked to on the CLTS website. And I urge you to read the full report. So I'm going to hand the mic now over to Jonathan Gray, who's going to be our discussant.
Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this really interesting and important discussion. And thank you so much, Kelly, for the invitation to be part of this and to join you today. And also to see this really exciting work in progress. I think one of the things that also emphasize to those of you who, I'm sure most of you know this, but Kelly's recent book from last year is, of course, highly relevant to many of these conversations. And I hope we can also maybe during discussion surface some of the ways in which I think it is relevant to ongoing questions about how to respond, basically, and how to formulate different kinds of collective responses, including but not limited to governance arrangements, regulation, and other kinds of responses. So I am, as Kelly mentioned, senior lecturer or associate professor in critical infrastructure studies at King's College London, and co-founder of a research network called the Public Data Lab. My work is partly around the politics of open and public data practices. I've done various reports and papers on citizen-generated data, on different forms of data activism, on data infrastructures. And I guess, I'm currently working on finishing a book on data worlds, which looks at some of the conventions of open data, different ways of knowing and seeing and being with data, different ways of organizing participation with data, and different forms of transnational coordination with and through data, as well as ways of imagining and responding to what data might be missing, including different ways of making data and different forms of kind of collective and participatory data infrastructures, and finally exploring the prospect of critical data practices, so incorporating different ways of reflecting on the social life of data, on the cultural dimensions of data, and bringing that into different kinds of ways of engaging with data. So obviously many of the things that were discussed are of great interest to me from that kind of research hat. I think though, from the point of view of how to respond, it seems like there's a very interesting moment, but from what I can gather from Kelly and the different presentations that we've heard today. And the basic question about how to formulate collective responses to these developments, how we might proceed, even who and what should be involved in formulating collective response, who we should talk to, what devices or formats we should reach to. I think we're also at a moment where in many ways the kinds of devices and formats for involvement or for responding are clearly not working. I think we can be quite frank about that in relation to everything from biodiversity crises to recent reports on climate change, to rising levels of inequality, to all kinds of gender and racial and other kinds of social inequalities. Like, there are many ways in which the kinds of instruments and formats and policies that we might reach to are not serving as we might hope, and that includes many of the kinds of things that we might reach to in information policy. So I think, of course, two of the really prominent approaches in information policy in recent years have been opening data up or sharing data more broadly, and then keeping data private. But of course, just the kinds of data that is being generated and processed and used today, it's a really clear example of where some of those approaches are going to be inadequate, like looking beyond open data, looking beyond focus on personal information and privacy, also kind of slightly stretching our imaginations when we think of what governance and regulatory approaches might look like, not least because we're also talking about the agricultural situation as something which does not only involve farmers and crops and land, but also increasingly may involve sensors, devices, platforms, cloud infrastructures, data centers, documents, machine learning, as well as different kinds of life forms, ecologies, and cultures, weather patterns. So there's a lot more involved in some of these emerging kinds of infrastructures and arrangements. And I think the first thing to say, and this is something that really we take from our research fields, is slowing down and thinking carefully about what kinds of responses are appropriate is important. I think, Kelly, you formulate this in your book towards the end as staying with the trouble, drawing on Donna Haraway and others' work in this area. So I think that's one thing. Clearly, like, reconsideration of what the situation is and what the response should be is extremely important. That comes through in the report and in Kelly's presentation of Jonathan's work, including discussion of local context, culture, existing practices, implications and impact, as is mentioned on page 3, user-centric data governance models, and explicit discussion of how data governance can deepen justice and prosperity. And it's great to see enthusiasm about rooting this in different conceptions of participation and power, who implements the system, who owns the data and infrastructure, and whose ideas are encouraged. That's great. I think maybe also just to add to that, we might think, yes, and what else may be involved as well? What do we mean, for example, by meaningful participation? And here there is lovely work that we can draw on. Just to give a couple of recent examples, Norcha Maraz's work on material participation, where she rethinks participation is something that can be assumed as something that's desirable in many different kind of policy and political contexts. But her work also looks at how materials and infrastructures, our devices, also participate and might be envisaged to participate, and the kind of political and social implications of that, and what it means to take material participation seriously. So on the one hand, there's very interesting work in science technology studies that's kind of rethinking participation in this way, rethinking who might be invited and what might be involved when it comes to thinking about participation. There's also fantastic work from Chris Kelty looking historically at participation in his book called The Participant, where he looks at the histories of surveys and polls and other ways of configuring involvement, which I think there is much to be learned from. It also seems that in the examples that are being discussed, there is no shortage of participation that's being configured in very specific ways. And I think here we also have to talk about the notion of the platform, both as a rhetorical model, but also as a computational model, which has very specific economic and technological properties and affordances. Our colleague Anna Helmond in Amsterdam talks about the double logic of the platform as something which centralizes data and distributes interfaces. In her case, she's talking about online platforms, right, like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, which gather data together as well as multiply the ways in which platforms can interface and be entangled with many areas of life. I think thinking through the implications of not only datafication, but also platformization in agriculture seem to be very important in terms of what you could call kind of learning around regulation and governance and taking seriously some of those conversations, but also, as Kelly alluded to, thinking about AI and machine learning. And there's a wonderful phrase, I think, from Wendy Chun about how learning with machines can be considered in terms of configuring relations between the past and the future, and drawing on the past in order to produce the future. And I think here it's really interesting to think about the implications of collecting agriculturally relevant data of many kinds, and using those to not only make predictions and to inform decision making, but also to shape and to perform and to produce different kinds of futures in our food systems, in our ecologies, and so on. And I guess the broader context of this is also learning around what soil scientists and others call critical zones, that is, zones of planetary life around this thin band that we inhabit, where, you know, we're not only talking about food systems or kind of farming crops, but also soil conditions, weather, and other kinds of life forms, whether they be microbial or you know, other kinds of plants and aspects of those ecosystems which are required to sustain life on Earth. So I think taking a kind of relational sensibility and not taking data for granted, not taking what kinds of data is useful for granted, could be good places to start. So just to finish with a few questions, rethinking what different kinds of community-centered and participatory arrangements might look like for agriculturally relevant data, rethinking what kinds of data is collected and how, what kinds of data should be collected and not collected, and how this kinds of data might be used and not by different actors in a much more potentially diverse array of contexts that we might immediately think of, given various developments in also machine learning and artificial intelligence. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was so interesting. I wrote down your typology, and it would have been a fantastic way to organize this conversation, I realize in retrospect. You know, who should be involved in data governance or data regulation, and even then, what counts as participation. And I really like the idea of thinking beyond human relationships, especially in this context. What are the methods or mechanisms? You talked about, you know, open data, which is the key theme, right? Especially in the governance initiatives. But then, you know, what are the other tools? Sarah Louise talked about the legal mechanisms, and as they influence private, you know, policies written into terms of use or license agreements. But are there other methods or mechanisms? The Bill and Melinda Gates report obviously gives us some, but, you know, as you said, there's a need to think very carefully, and I want to ask you more maybe about open data, but also what counts as data. I think that's really interesting. And then what are the issues? You know, one thing, and I won't do this, I'll go to the questions first, but I want to circle back and on this idea of what are the issues. It struck me today that I think there's a conversation that needs to be had around the distinction between legal compliance and also social justice or environmental justice. Because, you know, right now, I think what we saw with Sarah Louise's presentation is private sector doing what they need to do, right, to comply with the existing laws. And of course, there are gaps in the laws. That's why we're having this conversation. But what if we were to think not just, you know, how can we advance privacy legislation, or not how could we advance data access through law, but how could we advance broader principles around social justice, either through legal mechanisms or other mechanisms like broad governance and participation. So I want to circle back on that. But there are some questions in the chat. So Ushnish asks, are the data governance practices more responsible for nominally socially responsible organizations like, say, cooperatives or community-owned farms? Or do these, like, does the problematic data governance, it really come from the private sector? And I think that's so interesting. You know, actually, Ushnish, I will say, I'm going to do something kind of cheeky and share my screen again. Do I have my presentation up? Because I did actually have a slide, and Jonathan alluded to my book. This is something I really explore in my book. I don't know if people can see that, but in my book, you know, I really set out to write my book exploring your exact question, sort of. I was thinking, you know, what are these? It seemed to me that there were interesting things happening, as you say, among cooperatives interested in data and data sharing and open data. And there's this example of this machine learning platform that's written according to open access and copyright commons. It's written on GitHub, right? Open source code, open data sharing. So very much these principles of open data governance and participatory governance or farmer-centric data governance that Jonathan was talking about, or the Bill and Melinda Gates report writes about. This is a group that does this. And I would say, yeah, a lot of the issues around lack of access, lack of transparency, they don't really matter in this context, right? And in that one sense, it's they do better, I suppose, right, in terms of broadening access and participation. But interestingly, you know, and when you look at the private sector, as Sarah Louise did, and I do in my book, if you look at the legal agreements around the data sets that are not open, they're obfuscated. If you look closely at the language, actually the corporations, and I think that the data scientists or lawyers in-house at these corporations would say, we're actually using this tight control over data or data restriction, a lack of access and openness, for two reasons. One, technical, right? To create a really, really sound, uniform data set, a clean data set that ends up being really useful for generating tools and farm decision advice, right? As opposed to like crowdsourced data that raises all sorts of technical challenges. But the second, if you really look at the legal language, the corporations really use privacy and the protection of farmer privacy and really the possibility for identification or re-identification as a justification for a tightly controlled. So I think the private sector would say, actually, we're legally compliant with privacy law. And moreover, lack of access for us isn't an issue. It's actually a means to protect farmers. I mean, we could have a whole debate about that, but so I thought that related to this question you're asking. I think on one level, my response to your question would be, sure, we see that the data access issue doesn't exist really with the more cooperative digital farm strategies. It maybe raises other technical issues, and maybe Jonathan Gray would have something to say about issues around openness and access more broadly as not a panacea, right? But I would say that the private sector, even though the data access is a real issue, there's a use almost of privacy legislation to enable that, right? I mean, that's the cynical take. A private sector actor would probably say, no, we need this tight data control in order to protect farmers. And actually, there was a recent issue with John Deere tractors hacked by so-called Russian actors. This is how the media reported it. And John Deere was able, because of a centrally managed system and because of the interpretation of copyright law that prevents farmers from fixing their tractors and restricts farmers in some ways with the equipment, the digital equipment, John Deere was able to kind of protect, right, a kind of prevent a national security issue. So there's a kind of tension there, I think, between privacy law and data access as a broad principle that could drive legislation or governance. And actually that relates to your other question, which is around right to repair. So you also ask, do we see parallel developments around right to repair, which has been a real focus of conversation around the need for legislative reform. And I don't know if Jonathan wants to say something about right to repair or open data. I can stop sharing. If you want to say anything,
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, such good points. I think it unfortunately is so often the case that there are often no shortcuts. And you know, as one of my colleagues, Michael Dieter puts it, we can often value creative problem solving, but here also as science technology studies scholars, there is also a value of kind of taking seriously the creative formulation of problems and trying to understand problems that emerge from different kinds of responses, which is not like just a downer. I think it's taking seriously how you always find new kinds of frictions and issues to learn from with these different kinds of situations that should be taken seriously. And I think you're absolutely right that this is maybe one of the difficulties in formulating collective responses is this is not just a matter of compliance. I'd even go a little bit further and say that what justice entails, what social justice or ecological justice entail in these situations is also not always clear, or the means through which justice can be obtained is not always clear. And that's partly because the different kinds of issues that arise and the different kinds of ways in which relations are configured and the different kinds of communities, both human and non-human, that may be affected can change significantly, especially when you start to think about creating dependencies between agricultural practices upon which food production depends, different kinds of platforms and infrastructures and arrangements, data centers and clouds. Like there's all sorts of scope for new things coming up, which we should be receptive to. On openness, I think it's also important to say that while it is true that experimentation with open data and open source code are great to see, it's wonderful that there is experimentation in this area. Of course, we also know that openness of data and of code and other things always exist in different kinds of social and economic and technological circumstances, which mean that they can produce different kinds of effects. So, for example, open data can be very easily ingested into platforms and cloud-based infrastructures and proprietary artificial intelligence based systems. And so there are also opportunities for new kinds of problems and inequalities, as well as more community-based experimentation and learning. So that's always something to think about and consider. I think in my book project, part of the thing that I'm interested in contributing to is to take the material arrangements of these kinds of cultures and policy development seriously. So not only to think of the discourses or the terms and conditions, but also to think of infrastructure as a site of learning and experimentation. So not just thinking, oh, we need a license and we need a clerk agreement and maybe we should have a hackathon, but also to think, you know, what are the, who is able to turn up? Who is invited to participate? What kinds of issues are the starting point? What kinds of questions are the starting point for inquiry? And I guess on the flip side, it's important to think who and what might be missing always, which issues might be missing, which communities might be missing, and how can they be better resourced and supported. And I guess here may be one of the other things that we haven't really explicitly discussed, but I think could be very useful when we talk about policy responses and governance, is also to think about resourcing and funding smaller scale experimentation and learning and community-based approaches and community-owned approaches, as well as regulation as focused on what we should not do, which of course often raises the cost of different actors being involved, because involvement involves compliance, which can also be expensive and which can also require getting legal consultation or whatever. So I think that's something also that is very familiar from platform regulation. And I think Cory Doctorow has also written quite a bit about this, about how the flip side of regulation can also be shrinking the space of involvement for those without very large organizations or budgets to be able to meaningfully comply with regulation. So I think taking seriously the ways in which learning happens and participation is invited, and also taking seriously the different situations of those who might be involved, including the fact that there is a burden to participation, and that is something that can be quite differentiated. And people talk about the epistemic burden of asking, for example, marginalized communities for more involvement and more input when they're often already kind of overburdened and overcommitted and face various other issues in daily life, let alone public policy input. So I think thinking slightly more broadly. I think that the report has fantastic starting points and some great principles and approaches. But I think it's also interesting to think, also in light of Kelly's book and other research in this area, what else we might do to formulate collective responses to this situation.
Yeah, that's great. That the burden of participation is something that I struggle with in my research, because most of my projects are participatory or community driven, and there are various ways to compensate, right? or try to work against that burden by, say, an appropriate reimbursement or compensation, but that doesn't get at the full cost, participation cost, and it doesn't always get at the problem of only accessing the already interested, right? And how do we access the still small voices, or those people perhaps most made marginal through this so-called digital transition in agriculture, right? Like temporary foreign workers or other very marginalized individuals in our food system. We have, thanks, Jonathan. We have I realized a comment that was made earlier, and I should have dealt with that one first. It was made right off the bat by Ken Attic, and they've pointed us toward work they've done in the European context, looking at European developments. One of the papers really piques my interest because it includes in the title, Moving Beyond Data Ownership and the Access Debate, which I think was what I was trying to get at before. I wanted to circle back to that conversation about the law. And actually, this isn't specific to agriculture, but I find this around data and AI governance more broadly. The conversation often gets kind of circumscribed by, or, trapped within a conversation about privacy and about access, and as opposed to broader concerns around social justice, which, as you said, Jonathan, that's way harder to deal with from either a policy or regulatory policy perspective. Anyway, I'm wondering whether the person who goes by the name Ken Attic is with us and could speak to that paper or that work that they've done in Europe. I don't know if they are enabled to do that, actually, maybe not. But I would, okay, they can't, guest can't speak. Okay. So, but I'm going to put this paper in the broad chat, and we're all going to hopefully look at this paper around data governance, and this is specific to Europe, but I think that might have some really important nuggets here. Oh, Melissa repeated it too, so it's there twice. Maybe I'll just do a quick summary. I know that there are some policy and some probably regulatory policy folks in the audience, as well as folks who are, doers and practically minded. And I'd like to try to maybe summarize what we've said today before we say goodbye to everyone. So I'll just quickly, I think we've decided, or perhaps I said, that there's a need to think about agriculture as a specific domain when we think about data, both regulation and governance more broadly, whether it's farmer-based or community governance. So, and why do I think we need to imagine the legal landscape as particular? For a host of reasons, including agricultural data aren't just personal, right? And I think there's a whole separate conversation we can have. And I have an article, which hopefully soon should be coming out, on the distinctions that can be made between environmental data and personal data. Environmental data don't appear to raise the same as acutely, right? The same issues as, for example, a recidivism app that puts Black men disproportionately in jail, right? They don't seem to raise the same bias in terms of gender and other, systemic racism, et cetera. But environmental data matter. I try to make that point in my book and in every conversation, that it's a bit of a slow burn, but these data are important. They could be important in helping us solve some of the grand challenges of our time, both social and environmental. And, I mentioned that one example in the agri-food sector, there's a real potential that these data could participate in reinforcing historic harms, specifically inequity in the food system. Okay, so I think I'm gonna end by just underscoring the point that I think there's a need to really imagine data law, but also data governance more broadly, specific to the agri-food sector. The other thing, so what were some of the issues that were raised today that we could use as to generate solutions? Well, Sarah Louise mentioned even just the legibility, right? I know that's one principle, legible or transparent AI, the legibility of legal terms of use around a tool for farmers, right? When the average age of a farmer in Canada is 56, right? When it's not fair to ask a user, right, to take on the responsibility of becoming a data scientist in order to understand what's being done with one's data or farm data, there needs to be I think, or there could be a requirement for an increasingly legible set of terms of use or the licenses around these tools. That's one issue that Sarah Louise mentioned. I mentioned one of the issue that's specific to the agricultural sector, which is that if we look at how data are being used by the private enterprises, it seems clear to me that data can be used to further entrench already really unfair market advantage among agribusinesses. So, for example, right, if we look at the way that the data themselves, but also the legal agreements are being used to lock farmers into particular companies or using particular chemicals, right? Disincentivizing farmers or disabling farmers from changing, right, between digital systems. We saw this with GMOs, and it's very similar with big data. As one example, the system, so I showed you the screenshot of John Deere's system. The systems are not interoperable. So a farmer, right, can't use, one particular digital sensor and then another platform. The systems are concentrated within the same ecosystem of products within a firm. And it's no surprise that the digital support platforms are going to recommend other products like chemicals and seeds from the same firms, right? The same firms that are supplying seeds and chemicals are now data companies. And so there's this real kind of potential for a further concentration of market power. I think the good news is that actually we could use legal mechanisms to counteract that. So for the regulators, if you happen to be in the audience, not just data law, privacy law, for example, but what about anti-competition law, right? These are some of the most concentrated corporations historically. And so like has been done in Europe, could we not use antitrust or anti-competition law to kind of lock down on some of the not so great data practices in the same way we might use data legislation around privacy to try to engender environmental and social justice. So I think we need to imagine this suite of legal tools at our disposal, or how they could be created. One of the things that was mentioned is this need to maybe look beyond just the law, so at governance more broadly. And the Bill and Melinda Gates report, I think, points us in a good direction. What are some broad paradigms for governance, including participation, right, of end users in the development of governance models, whether they're around a specific technology designed by private sector or around public sector data? But then, as Jonathan in his discussant presentation said, we also have to be careful about what we mean by participation, right? And some of the costs of participation. How could, say, the public sector and the government incentivize participation, not just participatory models of data governance, maybe through policies and programming, funding, right? Ground up development of agricultural data programs, but also maybe incentivizing and compensating for participation and giving people a broad suite of citizen skills to participate in data governance initiatives. So there's this need to think not just about law and legal tools and the amendment of legal tools specific to agriculture, but to think about governance more broadly. And that report has lots of great examples, these case studies of different mechanisms for governance. But as Jonathan said in his discussant portion, we also then have to think carefully about what we mean by open, whose data get opened. Are there tensions when we ask an Indigenous community? Of course there are, to open data, right? Potentially sensitive data. Are private sector data being open to the same extent that public sector data are opened? And if not, right, and we know this is happening in the ag context, I've written about it in publications, those open data get then used, right, to just further generate profit, basically, for already profitable and powerful private sector actors. Okay, so I think that covered a lot of the bases. I'm not sure, Florian, whether you're there and you want to do a little summary, or Jonathan has anything that I missed that should be in the heads of people as they walk away. But I think this is just the beginning of a conversation that could be had around, right, who should participate, What are the methods or mechanisms, whether they're legal or more broad governance initiatives like participatory data governance? What counts as data, right? Are environmental data to the same extent that like data collected on one's person are? And what are the issues? I think those are broad themes that could actually structure a future conversation between academics and policymakers and lawyers.
I just wanted to briefly thank you again for the invitation, but also to emphasize that there's so many things that could be done. So I also, there are many things which many ways in which things should slow down. We shouldn't take for granted how to respond. But that said, there are fantastic conceptual, methodological, legal, logistical, infrastructural ways of responding that we can draw upon. So it's a great time for learning and experimentation. There are also so many relevant approaches, such as in science technology studies and data studies. There's the notion of data journeys, which is very simple, but just following data around and seeing who is involved and who is affected potentially by different forms of data infrastructures and data work. And also, there's a lot of great work at the moment on data feminism, on indigenous data practices and data sovereignty, as you mentioned. But also, there's a lot of work around data policy. I think one of the phrases from one of our colleagues in data studies is shifting from data sets to data settings. So trying to account for the situations in which data is produced and used a bit more than we often do, in a bit more specificity and depth. So this seems to be all really exciting. Areas for learning. And
I think that's great, Jonathan. And actually, and I use this in my book, but one great short article, I think it's from the journal Data and Society for People, is Ignacio and Klein's 7 principles for data feminism. It's mostly for like people who are on the production end of things, right? Generating a data set. It's for the computer scientists, the data scientists working public-private sector. But I think the same principles could be used to influence the development of governance or legislation. So that's a really good, maybe we can link to it off of the CLTS site. And I would just say one last thing I forgot. One takeaway is the data journeys is a great idea. And that's what I tried to do in my book. But it's made really difficult because of the law, because the law currently is being used, right, it's very difficult to do a kind of even a validation on some of the commercially available AI tools to get a peek at the data sets, how they might work, who they might advantage or disadvantage. It's hard to do that kind of critical scholarship, actually, because the legal mechanisms like trade secrecy, but also intellectual property and copyright law currently prevent it. And someone mentioned right to repair and the issues that raises for farmers and tractors. And so, in the same way that the copyright legislation is a problem for farmers wanting to tinker with their tractors, it's also a problem for scholars like myself to try to do what Jonathan just suggested, which is to trace the data. So that's one maybe site for potential legal reform. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And on this note, I will thank you both of you and also the other speakers that couldn't attend for like the content and the conversation today. Thank you so much. And speaking of copyright, AI, data mining, we're actually hosting a conversation on this exact topic with 3 colleagues of mine next Tuesday on the 18th. So you can find all of the information on AISociety.ca to register for this very cool conversation. So thank you again for everybody in attendance today, and we look forward to having more outputs coming up from this research and to welcoming you for other AI and Society virtual conversations. Bye-bye.